Hi, listeners. Welcome back to Adopting the Podcast. As always, I'm so excited to be your host for this journey. I'm Nicole Witt, Executive Director of the Adoption Consultancy, where we guide pre-adoptive parents step by step through the adoption journey. In Adopting the Podcast, we're going to focus on the issues, questions, and concerns you have as you get started in your adoption journey. This is for people just considering adoption, brand new to adoption, or very early in the process who are trying to get their questions answered and figure out their best path forward. Also, just to kind of learn about what to expect and how the process works. Over the last few episodes, we've focused on openness in adoption, both in the immediate time of placement, shortly thereafter, and longer term. Today, we're going to return to talking about an element of the adoption process itself, and that's the ICPC, which stands for the Interstate Compact on the Placement of Children, which is certainly a mouthful, but we'll get into more details throughout today's episode. But put simply, the ICPC comes into play when you are adopting from a state other than the one in which you live. It's basically a lot of legal paperwork that both states need to approve, actually sometimes three states, but we'll get to that. Joining me today to dig deeper into what it is, what it involves, what it means legally, what the timing tends to be, and how to manage the wait is Robert LaMarche, Executive Director and Attorney for ACF Adoptions. Rob has been in the adoption field since 1996. He has worked in both the public and private sectors in child welfare and has experience in both intercountry and domestic adoption. As mentioned, Rob is the Executive Director and Attorney for ACF Adoptions, a private nonprofit adoption agency that has been providing services since 1992. He is both an attorney and a licensed clinical social worker. Rob is a former foster parent and the proud adoptive parent of two sons and a daughter. Rob is an advocate for ethical adoption reform. He's a member of the Florida Adoption Council, the National Council for Adoption, and a fellow in the American Academy of Adoption and Assisted Reproductive Attorneys, where he serves on the agency and ethics committees. Thank you so much for joining me today, Rob.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Nicole.
Great. So although this topic can seem overwhelming and stressful to those who are new to adoption, it really is quite straightforward once it's explained clearly. So today's episode might be a little bit on the shorter side, but nonetheless, it's very important in helping people understand what to expect from this critical part of their adoption process. But before my first question to you, let me just briefly lay the groundwork. So people who are brand new to adoption often assume that they'll be adopting within the state in which they live. But that's not necessarily the case. I would say that the majority of my clients adopt from a different state. And that can be for a variety of reasons. It can be because they want to do as broad an outreach as possible. Sometimes it can be because they want to adopt from a state in which the laws are more protective of the adoptive parents than their home state's laws are. Sometimes they match through a personal connection and the expectant mom happens to live in another state. So it can be for a variety of reasons. So my message to our listeners is not to assume you'll be adopting within your home state, as you never know what situations arise. So with that said, let's start at the very beginning. Rob, can you please explain kind of in layman's terms what the ICPC is?
Sure, absolutely. So you're 100% correct in stating that many families adopt across state lines. At this point, I'm sure your listeners all know what a home study is. What I say to everybody is that home studies travel. You're not limited to your home state with that home study. And you shouldn't limit yourself because the adoption process can already have a lot of ups and downs and uncertain timeframes. And if you're limiting yourself to perhaps the one small state that you live in that maybe doesn't have very favorable adoption laws, you may never get a placement. And folks should be open to looking across state lines with eyes wide open in terms of, trying to match with an expectant mom. So the Interstate Compact for the Placement of Children really started in the 1950s or 60s. There were a number of states on the East Coast that were facilitating adoptions and started getting concerned about whether or not the families who were adopting these children had the resources to provide for them, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of the language is really couched in the best interest of children, like making sure that the receiving state, that the family in the state that's adopting the child has the resources and the wherewithal to take care of that child. But when you think about it, the state is really just interested in making sure they don't become responsible for the child. Right. So,
right.
the state of Massachusetts, I'm just picking Massachusetts, of course, has a vested interest in making sure that that family who's adopting that child, say from Texas, so it's a Massachusetts family adopting a child from Texas, that they understand the medical issues with that child, the needs of that child, so that that child doesn't become a ward of the state of Massachusetts. And
Right.
it's better for the kid, but it's also better for the state for that not to happen. So ICPC is a mechanism by which states can monitor and control to some degree which children leave their state and which children come into their state.
Okay. Okay, that's really interesting background. I actually didn't realize sort of the impetus behind where this started, and also great point about the home studies that they travel. Okay, so now that everyone has a general understanding, taking into account a more legal perspective versus a layman's perspective, is there anything that you want to layer on top of that?
Well, the biggest legal implication to all of this is that in most states, and of course, I'm an attorney in Florida, so I can't speak with authority on every state, but in most states, when you go to finalize your adoption, the court is going to ask the attorney if the interstate compact has been complied with. And if it hasn't, the judges shouldn't finalize your adoption.
Right.
So, because the safeguards were not in place, right? The states did not approve it. So, potentially, if you were to, have an adoption across state lines and not respect the compact, you could be jeopardizing the ability to finalize your adoption in your state court. And then what? That's not a position that you want to find yourself in. I think, if you don't mind, Nicole, I think what I'd like to tell everybody a little bit is just a little bit about the structure
Please.
of the organization. So every state has an interstate compact office. Right? Every state has their own. And the state that the child is born into, the state the child is leaving, right, is called the sending state. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The agency or entity handling that adoption in the sending state is the sending agency. All right. And I'm going to stick with Texas and Massachusetts for ease, right?
Okay.
So that would make, in our initial situation, the sending state and the sending agency are Texas. And the receiving state and the receiving agency are going to be in Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So every state has their interstate compact office. There's a national organization, and it's like the AAIPCC, and that they just sort of weigh in if there's issues between the states that need to be resolved. But for the most part, you're never going to deal with the national organization. It's going to be your state to state. So an organization like mine is going to have to send certain information. We'll get into the details about that information in a bit, to the interstate compact office in the sending state to review.
Yep.
Right? All the agencies have a list of what's required by their state, and that is going to go to their interstate compact office. The interstate compact office in the sending state is going to review those documents to make sure everything is there that they expect to be there. And they're also going to be mindful of ensuring that every document that Massachusetts wants to be there is there, right? Okay. So, Texas has their own list of things that they want to see to make sure that this adoption is being done in the sending states according to their rules and regs.
Right.
But they also know the child is going to Massachusetts, and they want to make sure that they send the child or the documents that Massachusetts expects to see. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the sending state's going to review everything, assuming it looks good, they're then going to send it to the receiving state, again, in this case, Massachusetts, through something called niece, like your nephew, your niece.
Okay.
And niece is just the initials for whatever
Right.
the system is. It's technology. It's a portal. They upload it. It
Right.
gets shot off to Massachusetts. Your administrator in Massachusetts can log in and see all the information,
Okay.
right? It's top secret. You don't send all this stuff via email, which is bizarre because they have us send it to them via email, but it is what it is. So one of the questions that people ask all the time is, well, how long does that take?
Right.
Right? Every state has their own scheme. I'm sure it's based on, the time of the year, how many employees they have. But for example, in Florida, they say they have 7 to 10 days to review that packet before even sending it on.
Right.
It never takes that
Yep.
long. 2 to 3 days, with rare exception. And then it gets forwarded to the receiving state. Okay. I don't know why I didn't use Florida as an example. Honestly, because I was emailing with Heidi, who is the executive director of an agency in Texas, before I got on here. So Texas was in my
In
head.
your mind.
But so they're going to send the information via niece, and then the receiving state is going to pull up that information. They're going to go through it and make sure that everything they expect to see is there, and then they're going to issue an approval,
Okay.
which is a 100A.
Okay.
A moment there. All right, a 100A. They oftentimes will just give a verbal approval that everything looks good and now the family can return home.
Okay.
Because again, what this all means is that the adoptive family has traveled to the sending state, right? They've traveled from Massachusetts to Texas. Baby was placed with them, and they're hanging out in Texas until they can go back to Massachusetts until they get this approval.
Right.
So this packet got submitted. It was reviewed by Texas. It got reviewed by Massachusetts. Massachusetts says, great, you guys can come home. At some point, it's going to generate that document. The family doesn't need it. The verbal is typically fine, and they can travel home. All right.
Yeah.
My experience is that the receiving state, 99% of the time, issues their approval the day they receive it or the next day. They're typically very fast.
Okay.
Because they're just looking and basically all the boxes are checked.
Right.
Like, oh yeah, Texas sent it to us and they have everything we need. And, everybody has like their pet documents that they're going to look at to make sure. But typically the receiving state reviews them very quickly.
Okay.
And if something is missing or something is unclear, then that is something that they, have the right to request. And it would go back through the sending state ICPC office, who would then contact the sending agency and ask for new or improved document X, Y, or Z.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Thank you. That's an excellent explanation. And I'm going to follow up on a couple of things. But as you were speaking, one question came to mind that I have a lot of clients ask about in terms of what if the states have different laws? So for instance, what if the sending state allows more in the way of birth mom expenses that can be paid than the receiving state allows? Is the receiving state then going to reject the ICPC because it doesn't follow their laws?
That would be very unusual, right? Because if the child in this situation, we're assuming that a Texas agency is doing the adoption and doing it according to Texas law, right? And as long as there's no like flagrant violation of Massachusetts law, then states honor each other's laws in that regard, right? So Massachusetts isn't in the business of telling of Texas how they have to handle their adoptions. Okay. So that would be a really bizarre set of circumstances. Now, they will ask for disclosure about certain things. Some states really want to know about the funds. How much did a family pay to this agency or that agency, so they can see the money that was involved in a case. There are states that want to see a lot more medical records on mom and baby so that they understand if there are any medical issues that might be coming into their state, right? But in terms of outright rejecting a packet because, the receiving state's not, sort of philosophically aligned with the sending state's legal process, no.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay, so you've touched on some of this already, but so a lot of my clients worry that they will be responsible for managing the ICPC, and that's of course overwhelming to them. So can you talk a little more specifically about what kinds of documents have to be provided and who is actually responsible for providing them?
It varies quite a bit. There are documents that are needed from your home study provider. There are documents that will be needed from the prospective adoptive family. There are documents that will be needed by the sending agency. So I have one of our lists in front of me. And I thought, just to give people an idea, I'll read off what's on our standard ICPC submission to the state of Florida.
Perfect.
Okay. So we have to include the consent, the legal consent signed by the birth mother or the birth father, or whatever mechanism we use to terminate or attempt to terminate the rights of the father.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We have to include an affidavit concerning paternity, the birth mother's family, social, educational, medical history, and a statement about why we don't have that if we don't, if it's the case of a father, right? We have to submit an ICWA affidavit, which is the Indian Child Welfare Act, whether this is a child of Native, ancestry or not, a narrative background on the birth family, a counseling summary, which addresses whether or not the birth family had options counseling, a copy of a document that shows that the birth mother was advised of the adoption reunion registry services in the state of Florida, the baby's admission and discharge record, a disclosure statement signed by the adoptive parents that they understand whatever the medical issues might be as it relates to that child.
Okay.
So if a birth mother smoked marijuana and that shows up in her medical records, or had Hep C, or had a difficult birth, or baby has a genetic anomaly, that has to be listed in the disclosure, and the adoptive family has to sign it that they're aware.
Okay.
Sometimes that includes even just like mental health history of birth mom, anything that could potentially be a red flag. They want to make sure the family has signed a disclosure and that they've received any medical records that we've received up to that point. Okay. And in some states want to know if the family has spent time with the child and involved in their medical regimen before they've accepted placement. An adoption agreement signed by the adoptive family that basically outlines who's responsible for what, agency or them. An application filled out by the prospective adoptive family to ICPC, their home study, their background clearances, a letter from their home study agency saying that they're going to supervise the post-placement period, an at-risk placement affidavit signed by the adoptive family. Basically, this is usually around the legal issues, right? Because even when we have a valid surrender or consent to the adoption, typically entities like mine would not have had time to go to court already and terminate the birth parents' rights. It might have been only 2 or 3 days. Right. So these are all at-risk placements, and there has to be an acknowledgement by the adoptive parents that that is the case. Something in Florida called a statutory adoption disclosure, which is a general disclosure of our laws around adoption. The affidavit signed by a birth mom that she's selecting a family who lives out of state and that she wasn't forced to choose a family who lives out of state. A statement of all the costs and fees that an adoptive family incurred on the case, and a copy of the sending agency's license.
Okay.
So that's a lot of stuff.
Right.
Right? Yeah. So we tell our families that we will have that compiled and submitted to ICPC within 48 hours of having the last document that we need.
Okay.
All right. Our goal is for the last document we need to be the child's discharge summary and the signed placement documents by the family, which usually include that at-risk and disclosure statement.
Right.
Okay. So we turn those around pretty quickly. I would say this is a pretty average number of there's 16 lines here, but it's probably about 30 documents. That's pretty standard. There are a couple states, Georgia being one of them, that has even more. Okay. probably one of your questions is going to be, is there anything that adoptive families can be doing?
Right. Right.
And if it's okay, I will go into
Yeah,
that.
perfect.
Okay.
You read my mind.
All right. So as I was talking, you were recognizing, and other people listening to this were recognizing, oh, I know that document. I provided that to my, home study provider, whatever. I think that an adoptive family should have a copy of everything that they gave to their home study provider. Okay. Their clearances, their medicals, have it all. Just have it.
Right.
Okay. Because sometimes what happens, and this happened just to us over the holidays, different agencies have different hours and close at different times, right? Sometimes they're small mom and pop shops, there's nobody around. And I needed a document that was in a file in an office that was closed for the holidays.
Okay.
All right. And the family did not have a copy of that document. It was the only document holding them up from ICPC submission. Now, I happen to be personal friends with the social worker, and I called her, and she drove on Christmas Eve day, to the office and got the document and scanned it to me so we could at least get it submitted, right? And get the process going. If the family had a copy, it would have been easy. And there's, no saying that I'm always going to know the social worker personally and be able to, convince them to go into the office on their day off. Right. So I think the family should have it.
So the ideal scenario is that the agency has gathered the whole packet together, gotten all the documents from whoever they need to get them from. And then when they get those consent signing and the discharge papers, it gets put in there, and then the packet is done.
Correct.
So you mentioned that from state to state, it's pretty similar with a few exceptions. How, I guess, drastic are those? So for instance, you mentioned Georgia. So what if they have all the paperwork that they need for, what they know their state's ICPC is going to require, and then they get a last minute placement out of Georgia or a state like that? How much time or effort or logistics does that add to them getting whatever those additional documents are?
Sure. I mean, it's usually not terrible. It just depends on when it's hitting, right? If we find out Friday afternoon at 1:00 that we need another document, you're probably not getting it that day, right? Because again, it would be, Massachusetts telling Texas, telling the agency, and then, it goes through a lot of people for it to get uploaded. It has to go back through the system, but, if it happened at 10 a.m., it might happen. So, everybody knows that families are really wanting to go home. And it's hard to parent your newborn in a hotel in another state, 1,000 miles away or 2,000 miles away from your family and friends and stuff like that. So it's not like people are uncaring. It's just that there's a lot of steps, right? And there's a lot of places a document has to travel. Last minute cases happen all the time. And that it's hard because, a mom delivers, the family is matched, and it's a whole whirlwind of stuff. And all of these things have to be gathered very, very quickly. But, agencies are accustomed to it. And what is the worst case scenario? Well, the worst case scenario is you spend an extra couple of days in the state where your child was born, taking in some of the local flavor or local culture. It's unlikely that you're going to be delayed weeks.
Right.
I mean,
and it's not going to cause the adoption to fall apart.
No, it's not, and sometimes people are emotional and they want to get home and they miss their dog and whatever it is. And, we get it. And sometimes one parent, if it's a 2-parent family, maybe one parent has to go because there's other children at home or other things. That's fine. Just the baby can't leave.
Right.
So if grandma wants to come and stay and help out, that's fine. It's very unusual with a professional agency to have a protracted, ICPC process.
Okay.
It's rare.
Okay. Awesome. Okay. So you addressed the timing that we talked about. I mentioned in the introduction, I was talking about both states, meaning 2 states involved in the process. sometimes there can be 3 states. So can you talk about when that comes into play and how that changes the process or the timing, that kind of thing?
Sure. That can be really sticky, okay? Because there are states like Florida that says they won't process 3-state ICPCs, meaning they don't want the agency in one state or the adoption attorney, whoever's facilitating the adoption, the birth mother in one state, and the adoptive family in another state.
Right.
Florida doesn't like it and they won't do it. Okay. Now, a state like Georgia will do that, right? If your agency's in Georgia, their law specifically says that a family anywhere can finalize an adoption in Georgia if their agency is in Georgia. It's also not a requirement that the mother's in Georgia. So we happen to be licensed in Georgia because we do medically complex adoptions all over the country. So I can work with a mom in Illinois who's making an adoption plan for a child, let's say with Down syndrome. And we're using Georgia consents because we have a license in Georgia. And she placed that baby with a family in Utah.
Okay.
Okay. So you have a 3-state ICPC there. Okay. Technically, this is one of those areas where the national organization has issued an opinion about how do you handle 3-state ICPC cases. I don't think it makes any sense, but this is what they decided. Okay. That child coming from Illinois via a Georgia agency going to Utah, Georgia is the sending state.
Okay.
The Georgia agency has custody of that child. They're the legal parent, right? Doesn't matter that the kid is in Illinois.
Right.
Child is going to Utah. So this is a Georgia to Utah placement. It's 2-state ICPC, even though there are 3 states involved. Now, we had another case recently, North Carolina baby going to Alabama. North Carolina said they would like to be involved. Georgia said, sure, why not? So I'm like, sure, do whatever you want, folks. Just tell me what to fill out, right? I mean, I can make these papers go all over the country if you want. So then that actually became 3 states. But it was because North Carolina requested it and Georgia said fine. So basically, I had a packet of, the sending state going to Georgia, being a receiving state, being a sending state, going to Alabama. All right. That can potentially take some time just because you have another organization in there who might ask for another doc. That actually went incredibly smoothly. I was ready for it to be a disaster. But if everybody's communicating with one another, and like I said, the requests aren't so different, right? Were the appropriate legal documents signed? Is the family well aware of any issues, medical or legal issues on the case? Do they have an approved home study? And, when you're looking at those general things, 90% of it's the same. So as long as people are communicating well with one another, you can make it happen. But those are incredibly rare, those 3-state situations.
Okay, great. Okay, so you also mentioned about how the baby has to stay in the state until the approval comes through. So, and I'm certainly not advocating this, just hypothetically, what happens if people think, oh, well, nobody's going to know, we'll just go home anyway, and then they'll tell us that the clearance went through and we'll be like, great, but nobody will know that we've been home for a week. What happens then, and why should they not do
Well, there are a couple things that can happen. I mean, number one, in many situations, the adoptive parents are not even the legal guardians of the child yet, right? They're like almost like a foster parent in the sense that, the agency is a legal guardian and the agency has given certain rights and responsibilities to these adoptive families to have the child in their physical custody, to make medical decisions on their behalf, to love on it and all those kinds of things. But They can take the baby back if you're demonstrating that you're a family who just willy-nilly is going to do whatever you want, not follow through with what you agreed to the agency, which I can tell you, you agreed that you were going to wait on ICPC because it reflects very badly on the agency. It could impact an agency's
Right.
license. So, do you want to go rogue on your adoption agency with what legally is probably their baby? Mm,
Right.
do you want to cross state lines with a baby that's not technically yours against the legal guardian's wishes? I mean, there's a word for that.
Right.
So
Right.
I would, not advocate that. And then secondly, even if the agency was kind of like, oh, well, they were just, anxious or whatever, that agency attorney or the attorney handling that adoption is not going to stand up in front of a judge at the final hearing and perjure
Hmm.
themselves and say that the family complied. And in most
Right.
states, the statute requires that family comply with ICPC in order to finalize their adoption. I mean, no attorney is going to take a bullet for a family who just wanted to get back home because they didn't want to stay at the Holiday Inn any longer. Right. So
Right.
those are
Right.
really the most compelling reasons. Is there an ICPC police that's going to chase you across state lines? No, that's not a thing. But what is, what do we tell our kids? I mean, a law is a law, even if someone's not watching, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right. And why would you take that risk, that
Right.
huge risk?
Exactly. And
Absolutely.
and again, when
Absolutely.
you're typically talking about a delay, maybe of a couple of days, if you're looking for other, other documents, the biggest delay comes around home study expiration and clearance expirations. Okay.
Hmm.
Here's the issue there. There are some states that when they do your home study and your clearances, they're valid for 2 years. Awesome. That's great for that state. But if you're adopting from Florida, your home study is only recognized as valid for a year and your clearances are only good for a year. So
Right.
if you don't know that, and for some reason your agency in Florida doesn't realize, which they should see that your home study is dated what it is and what your clearances are. But let's say it was missed or it was a last minute case. And in the flurry of the match,
Right.
it's like, are you home study approved? Do you have clearances? Yes. Oh, I didn't even realize you were from a state that did 2 years. Getting a home study update on a whim and getting clearances when you're out of state already can be challenging, right?
Yeah.
Some of these clearances take a week, some of them are a couple of days, but you have to go to a vendor who's approved to run prints in your state. And there might be only one vendor in Florida and it might be 3 hours away. And you're like, you know, so those are where the most frequent delays are. So clearances have expired, our home studies have expired because the adoptive family state recognizes those clearances and home studies as being good for 2 years, but the
Right.
the the sending state's agency or attorney is in a state where they're only valid a year and nobody noticed until they're putting that
Okay.
ICPC packet together. That's a mess.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Um, okay. So before we shift gears to my last question, which is about the waiting period, is there anything else you want to add that we haven't talked about, that I haven't asked you about? Anything important about ICPC that we haven't covered?
Well, as I said, it's not imperative that both parents participate in that process, right? People worry about
Hmm.
this. I think it's wonderful if families can meet their baby together and that sort of stuff, but it's not always possible for, if it's a two-parent family, for both parents to stay that whole time, and that's fine. It's completely and totally acceptable, and it happens. Um,
Okay.
Organization is key. Going rogue and calling the ICPC office and demanding to know why it's taking so long, very ill advised. You can usually
Right.
find people's names and contact information online. I don't know why being mean to the people you want to process your paperwork is why anybody thinks that's ever helpful, but it does happen. And I can
Right.
tell you, your file just gets plunked on the bottom.
Exactly.
Trust your agency, to be advocating on your behalf in that regard. And the only other thing, I guess, that I would recommend is if you are adopting a child who is maybe has been in the hospital a long time. Let's say you have a preemie and you've already spent a lot of time in
Mhm.
the sending state. Talk to your agency about whether or not the sending state that you're in ever offers a like provisional approval or will accept a packet in advance. Because you
Mhm.
can, if they will, I've had situations where I've had families here with a baby in the NICU for, 2 months, and why wait another 2 weeks potentially
Right.
when I can send them 90% of the documents and they can review it and say, this looks good, pending the last three documents. And in those cases, we can typically get approval in a day or two rather than, a week or more,
Okay.
so it
Great
doesn't
point.
hurt
Great
to
point.
ask.
Right. Right. Okay. Okay, so for my last question, I'm going to ask you to take off your attorney hat and put on your social worker hat. And with all the people you've worked with who've gone through the waiting period, I'm sure you have seen people who handle it really well and people who handle it not as
Right.
well. So what is some of the advice you would give or some do's and don'ts for how to manage the wait
Okay.
time?
As I said earlier, your first, round of parenting your newborn in a hotel is often stressful. The
Mm-hmm.
feedback that I've gotten from families is families who are in a position to do like an Airbnb where they have like a more home and like environment where they have a little kitchen, where they have, laundry
Laundry.
and things like that, often tolerate that waiting period better than people who are in your more standard sort of hotel room and are figuring out how they're going to eat 3 meals a day with a baby who's
Mm-hmm.
sleeping and, eating and pooping every 2 hours and that sort of thing. Okay.
Right.
So I would recommend that if you're in a position to do it, to sort of create a more homey type environment. Secondly, especially if you're a single parent, bring somebody with you. Bring your mom, your sister, your brother,
Mm-hmm.
your best friend, somebody, because it's stressful already to be a first time parent, to be a single parent, to be getting to know your baby, to be exhausted, to be in a strange place, to have somebody there who can support you in caring for a little one while you're waiting and traveling with a little one and all the stuff that they have.
Right. Right. It's a lot
Right.
to carry.
Bring somebody with you. Um, Also, it's an opportunity, maybe you've never been to that state before. This is where your baby's from. Maybe there's, something about the culture that is reflected in your child that you want to go and experience, right? Maybe you want to
Mhm.
take some pictures with him or her in that space to say, look, well, I was in Texas. I went to I don't know, I went to the Rio Grande. I went to San Antonio, whatever. I don't know
Right.
where you are, but here are some pictures of me exploring the place with you from where you're from. Maybe you're never going to go back. I don't know, but take advantage of that, right? If you're in an open adoption, take advantage of that time to connect with the birth mother or the birth father or birth siblings. Um,
Right.
if you've been working with an agency and these are people you never saw in person, like go meet them. Like we love to see our families. We love to see our babies. Come on in, we'll have lunch. Those are some of the things that you can do to help sort of pass the time that I think are going to be meaningful when you look back.
Yep. Yep. That's great advice. Thank you. Okay, so there you have it, folks. That is ICPC. Again, listeners, my guest has been Rob LaMarche, Executive Director and Attorney for ACF Adoptions. And Rob can best be reached via email at R for Robert, LAMARCHE at adoptionflorida.org. Thanks again so much, Rob, for breaking this all down for us. Of course, listeners, most of all, I'd like to thank you for tuning in today. I hope you've heard something that takes away some of the stress and the mystery of the ICPC process for you. Take care, and I'll catch you next
Thank you,
time.
Nicole.
Thank you.